This podcast is brought to you by Proton Dealership IT, experts in dealership cybersecurity and IT management. Interested in a free cybersecurity, compliance, or IT consultation? Visit protontex.com. That's PROTONTECHS.com.
Welcome to Daily Drive for Thursday, July 31st, 2025. I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, Ford swings to a loss in the second quarter. Hyundai praises the U.S. trade deal with South Korea. And Toyota's suppliers look to pass on tariff costs. Plus, GM CEO Mary Barra will receive a Centennial Award as part of our Automotive News 100th anniversary. Our own Lindsay Van Hully joins the show to talk about her leadership through several challenges.
I think all of that sort of speaks to what executives told me about just her focus on trying to find solutions. And they described it as sort of creating a culture that really brings people around in that way to help kind of focus on finding solutions.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry. Ford says it lost $36 million in the second quarter on higher recall cost and $800 million in import tariffs. The automaker now believes tariffs will be a bigger burden this year than it previously projected. Adjusted earnings before interest and taxes fell 22% to $2.1 billion. Revenue in the quarter rose 5% to a record $50.2 billion as U.S. sales improved. President Donald Trump says he's reached a trade deal with South Korea. It would impose a 15% tariff on the country's exports to the U.S. and see Seoul agree to $350 billion in U.S. investments. Hyundai Motor praised the breakthrough tariff agreement between the U.S. and South Korea, calling it a, quote, historic achievement. It says the deal will allow the Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis brands to continue their investments and business strategy in the U.S., quote, with confidence. And some of Toyota's major suppliers are considering price hikes and changes to logistics to mitigate the impact of President Trump's tariffs. They include Denso, Toyota Industries, and Aishin. For Denso, measures to minimize the tariff impact include manufacturing what's possible in the U.S. and reevaluating logistics. Toyota Industries said tariffs resulted in a 3.5 billion yen hit to its first quarter results, and it will adjust prices among other countermeasures. And those are today's headlines. You can find more details on all those stories at autonews.com. Joining me now to talk about Ford's loss in the second quarter is Michael Martinez, who covers Ford and the UAW for us at Automotive News. Mike, welcome back to Daily Drive.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mike, Ford saw this loss while also posting record revenue. How are investors reacting so far to this report?
Well, immediately after they issued earnings, their stock fell in after market trading. But as of Thursday afternoon, it's up a couple percentage points. I think the general consensus is that investors are pleased with some of the underlying parts of the earnings. Take away the loss, take away the recall charges and the tariff impact. They see Ford as sort of strongly positioned to weather what's going to happen from tariffs because they build so many vehicles in the US. And they think there's going to be a tailwind from that recent EPA announcement about sort of gutting some of those climate rules because Ford does trucks, Ford does gas-powered vehicles really well. And it thinks maybe there's opportunities there to sell more gas-powered vehicles and to keep making money in business units like Ford Pro and Ford Blue, which both were positive in the quarter.
Well, what is Ford saying about its earnings for full year now, since it says tariffs will be a bigger burden than expected before?
Well, they sort of reissued guidance that's a little lower and a little narrower than it was in the past. They're expecting adjusted earnings before interest and taxes of between $6.5 to $7.5 billion for the full year. Before they were anticipating $7 billion to $8.5 billion. So they think tariffs are going to cost more money than they originally expected. They think it's going to be about a $2 billion hit for the full year. And that's after you factor in some offsets that they're planning in terms of pricing and production and things like that. So really, when you take a step back, it could still be a strong year for them, despite all these external factors and some of the internal factors too. Like we've talked time and again about how they struggle with recalls and warranty costs. They claim they're making progress. The results are just going to take a while to show up. We'll see whether or not that's true.
Always insightful, Mike. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Kel.
Coming up, our own Lindsay Van Hully joins the show to talk about her profile of GM CEO Mary Barra as part of our 100-year anniversary at Automotive News. That's next on Daily Drive.
While you provide top-notch support to your team and customers every day, is anyone taking the time to ensure your sensitive data remains secure? Just one click on a malicious link can place your entire dealership in danger. In fact, the average cost of a data breach surpassed $4 million last year. Stay one step ahead by understanding the threats and minimizing your risk. Proton Dealership IT works around the clock to provide you with support 24/7, 365. Operating out of a cutting-edge security operations center located in the USA, Proton continuously monitors, detects, and responds to your potential network issues or cyber threats. You've got a lot on your plate. Keep your focus on where it matters most, your customers. We'll handle the cyber support. Learn more about our comprehensive services at protontex.com. That's PROTONTECHS.com.
Welcome back to Daily Drive. I'm Kellen Walker. As part of our 100-year anniversary in 2025, we at Automotive News are honoring extraordinary individuals and families whose vision, innovation, and leadership have had a lasting impact on the automotive industry. One of those Centennial Award honorees is General Motors CEO Mary Barra, who has led the largest U.S. automaker through one challenge after another during her tenure. Our own Lindsay Van Hully spoke with several people who have worked closely with Barra over the years and wrote about it in Automotive News. Our own Jake Neer reached Lindsay at her home office near Lansing, Michigan.
Lindsay Van Hully, welcome back to Daily Drive.
Hi, Jake.
So, as I mentioned in the intro, Mary Barra is getting a Centennial Award as part of our 100-year anniversary, our birthday here at Automotive News. It's an interesting profile that you wrote about her, talking with a lot of the people that work most closely with her and have worked closely with her over the years. And one thing that is interesting about Mary Barra is that GM, it's a 100-year-old plus company, the largest automaker in the U.S. In the past, it's been known as being very set in its way. But Mary Barra has really reshaped the company during her tenure as CEO. I mean, it's been made much leaner, getting out of markets that weren't making money, setting really bold expectations about things like electrification, technology, self-driving. How has she been able to do that? What did the people that you spoke with say about her ability to, get that kind of buy-in in a company that's known for not changing very much over the years?
It's interesting. I talked with a number of current and former executives at GM in a variety of different areas about just her leadership, her experience. And one thing that came up over and over was this continuity that she's had, the amount of time that she's been not just in the CEO position, since the beginning of 2014, but with the company. She joined in 1980 as a co-op student and has been with GM, working her way up through the company ever since. And people I talked to said part of the reason that she's able to do this is that she understands the essentials of what has made GM. And she's also willing to take some risks in innovation. And that's been able to really kind of look at where have we been and where do we need to go for the future, recognizing, I think, that the industry is changing. And to stay competitive, GM is going to have to change with it. And there's been a lot of focus on electrification that gets talked about a lot. To your point, there's been a lot of efforts really around trying to find efficiencies and to simplify the product development process and manufacturing and, investing in autonomy and in software. And these are, not, when you think about an automaker, those aren't kind of the core competencies you think of for a company that's been building cars for 100 years. But increasingly, I think she sees that as going to be sort of critical to GM and taking that into the future. And so has put a lot of effort into investing in EV development and battery development and software. There's been a lot of expanded recruiting out in Silicon Valley, bringing in people with software and technology backgrounds that maybe hadn't considered the auto industry before, but sort of see it now as at this sort of cusp of software and technology and autonomy and electrification, and being able to be part of kind of building that from the ground up. And so, that's been something that's really grown over the last several years. And there are some people I talked to who said, the fact that she has been around for as long as she has means that she can both set the vision, but also has been in place to execute on it and to see it through. And that's, I think, very interesting, that kind of longevity and what that allows her to do.
And we should also mention the people that you got to talk to for this piece. You spoke with GM President Mark Royce. You spoke with Dan Ackerson, who was the CEO before Mary Barra, who announced that Mary Barra would be his successor in that role, and people she's worked with for a very long time inside the company, and also people from outside the company who have either gotten to know her or know her record as a leader. And so it's really interesting, the sort of the breadth of the sources you got to here. What did they say about some of her defining moments over the years? It's one thing to lead a company and set new directions with things being completely stable, but as we know, Mary Barra's tenure has come at a time that have presented some huge challenges.
Yeah, and this, it goes without saying that this industry is incredibly complex, and it's been a period of uncertainty and challenges. Thinking back over the last 5 years, a global pandemic, a semiconductor shortage that impacted production, a UAW strike, trade and tariffs now that the company is having to navigate through. But really, I mean, when you go back to the beginning, she took over as CEO in January of 2014. And, within weeks, her first real major leadership test began with the ignition switch recall. That was something that, had been going on for quite some time. And really, it fell to her to sort of navigate the company through this. And people I talked to said that, she really led with honesty and facts and trying to, outline this as best that she could, and really gave a message to employees that said, this can never happen again. I don't want to forget what happened so that we can make sure it doesn't happen again. And that really led to a company-wide cultural shift that was focused on safety. There's been a lot of other, kind of cultural shifts since. I think we talked about electrification already and what that's required of just the changing nature of what GM does. But there's been a number of other things that they've had to walk through, trying to find opportunities. That was something that Mark Royce had told me when we talked, that, the company has really, under Mary, sort of aligned around trying to find opportunities out of challenges rather than playing defense, play offense. And when you look at some of the ways that's happened in 2020, vehicle production was halted because of the pandemic. GM made face masks and ventilators during that time. When the semiconductor shortage was impacting production and what types of vehicles could be made, they were reconfiguring which trims got some of the high level chips. And they came up with creative workarounds to try and help some of the logistics issues that were keeping dealers' lots pretty thin on inventory. I think all of that sort of speaks to what executives told me about just her ability and really her focus on, trying to find solutions. And they described it as sort of creating a culture that really brings people around in that way to help, kind of focus on finding solutions.
I wonder, you've been covering the company for a little while now, and so you know a lot about Mary Barra's career, but were there any stories or tidbits that were especially interesting to you when you talked to your sources for this?
I think one of the things that is interesting to me, and it sort of builds on the fact that 2025 was also our 100 Leading Women project. So every 5 years, we compile a list of the 100 leading women in the North American auto industry. And Mary has been on that list, was on it again this year. And a number of women who were honored as part of that program this year really just highlighted her as an influential leader. The hard work that went into her success, but also the example that she sets, for others across the industry, not just in GM. And I thought it was interesting. I was talking with Jacqueline McQuaid, who took over as the global vice president of Buick GMC last year. And she was talking about how Mary has taken opportunities to really offer guidance throughout her career. And, whether it's, how you can kind of set expectations and succeed in your new role. And, earlier in her career, during a product presentation, kind of pulling her aside to offer feedback about, how that proposal might be stronger. And I think what was interesting about that is just when we heard so many women during the leading women list and during our conference in the spring talk about the importance of mentorship and guidance and, really learning from people who have been in the role for a while. And the fact that, people who are in these positions like Mary that have worked hard and they've risen to sort of the top of their companies, the top of their career, and are able then to give that feedback to people who are younger in their career, who are coming up in the industry. I think that's a really interesting story and example. I think just the fact that, in kind of keeping with what a lot of people talked about, just that ability to not just recognize talent, but also to kind of share and guide and, use the input, the experience that you've gained throughout your career to then share with others to help them grow.
Well, speaking of developing talent and making sure that there are people in place for the next generation of GM, I almost feel a little bit bad asking this because I feel like we've covered it every time we've had conversations like this because the question, the answer never really seems to change. But there has been chatter for years now about whether Mary Barra will stay in the job for much longer. She said that she serves as long as the board will have her. Do you sense that GM is planning for what happens if she were to depart anytime soon?
She hasn't said any, to your point, she hasn't said if there's a date in mind or how long she plans to be with GM. She's talked about, the work that she's doing now and, the transformation that's underway and that, she serves at the pleasure of the board. But, she is 63. She's been CEO now for 11 years. And so, there is that question about just how much longer is she in that role. But I think one of the things that she has talked about that we have heard her say is, GM is regularly working on succession and trying to build up a pipeline of talent, not just at the executive levels, but, further down in the company as well, so that there is a pipeline of talent that can, assume some of these other roles throughout the future. So that's what we know so far.
Makes sense. All right. Well, you can find Lindsay's entire profile of Mary Barra at autonews.com. It is how Mary Barra has guided GM through uncertainty while executing long-term vision. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us again here on Daily Drive.
Thanks, Jake.
That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to automotive news journalists Michael Martinez and Hans Greimel for their reporting for today's podcast. You can get the latest news on manufacturing, trade news, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. Come back tomorrow for a conversation with TransUnion's Satyen Merchant about how 18 million consumers or more can save on their auto loans.
That's a message really for any lender that's interested or has an auto refinance program to know that there is a market out there.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoyed the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.